When it comes to getting the most smartphone for your dollar, the Moto G has been one of the best choices for the past few years. Now with the Moto G4 and G4 Plus, Motorola hopes to make its budget lineup bigger and better, literally. The G4 starts at $200, while the slightly more useful G4 Plus starts at $250. Both phones have 5.5-inch 1080p screens, and they pack in Snapdragon 617 octa-core CPUs. They come with 2GB of RAM and 16GB of storage at the base level. The more expensive 32GB and 64GB models of the G4 Plus have 4GB of RAM. There are also non-removable 3000 mAh batteries in both phones and a microSD card slot for up to 128GB of additional storage. They differ in two major ways. The G4 Plus has a fingerprint sensor right below its screen, as well as a more powerful 16-megapixel rear camera with an f2 aperture lens with laser and phase detection autofocus. The standard Moto G4 only has a 13-megapixel camera and none of the newer autofocus technology. Both phones are comfortable to hold, and I particularly like the slightly textured feel of their back covers. Their displays are bright and detailed even in direct sunlight. They both performed well when it came to juggling multiple apps and loading complex games like Pokemon Go. Obviously they're not as zippy as expensive flagships, but I rarely felt like they were slowing me down. The G4 Plus with 4GB of RAM was better at multitasking, but not noticeably so. The Moto G4 Plus also took pictures quickly and generally delivered sharp photos in daylight and low light. The G4's shooter was merely average, and it really suffered in low light. Both phones also feature some unique Motorola gestures. Twisting them twice unlocks the camera, even when you're in standby, and making a double chop motion turns on the flashlight. Thanks to their large batteries, I was able to use both phones extensively throughout the day without running out of juice. Despite their solid performance, Motorola made a few strange design choices. Instead of being waterproof like last year's phone, they're merely water resistant. The G4 Plus's fingerprint sensor, which performed well, doesn't make much sense on the front of the phone since it doesn't function as a home button. Motorola also ditched having two front speakers in exchange for a single speaker. It's loud, but it doesn't sound nearly as good as before. Even with those downsides though, both the Moto G4 and G4 Plus are solid phones for their price. To get something better, you'd have to bump up to the Nexus 5X, which sells from $280 to $350, or the $399 OnePlus 3. I'd recommend spending the extra $50 for the G4 Plus's better camera. The 64GB G4 Plus with 4GB of RAM that I tested sells for $299, but even that's a good deal. Motorola's big problem with these new phones is that last year's Moto G was simply too good. By aiming bigger, it introduced more compromises. But ultimately, they're still great cheap phones.